Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. We have a fully loaded show to serve up for you here today. Before we're done, that means Davin Bellamy. How much of a great addition has Davin been to our DawgNation team here? A lot of thoughts from him on how you get ready for the first SEC game on Saturday, coming on the road at night, possibly in some weather. Davin will tell us all his thoughts about that on the show here today. Also, Mike Griffith stopping by there as well. How healthy is Georgia here in this spot for Saturday? How ready is Georgia, not just for Kentucky, but the incredibly difficult schedule that comes up after that? We'll cover all of that here today there as well. Also from Athens yesterday, fairly obvious there was a theme in place for UGA in terms of what it was putting out to the media about what it thinks matters coming into Saturday's game. We'll give you some of that today. What was on the mind of Georgia coach Kirby Smart last night. But to begin with, there is this. We are now a couple of weeks removed from a dominant Georgia win against the Clemson Tigers. Dogs have essentially stopped talking about it, but it is apparently still on at least one Clemson player's mind for a very strange reason. Some Georgia fans were pretty hot and bothered yesterday about this. We'll give you all of the details here coming up, including an explanation of why discussions like this matter, perhaps more than you possibly think. We'll do all of that here. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA Athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Georgia fans were upset yesterday, at least a lot of them were, reaching out to me via text message or social media, tag, whatever you want to call it. Not very happy with something that a Clemson player has had to say. Now, listen, we are very clear on this show. We have an obvious bias. I'm a Georgia fan. We do a pro-Georgia show. We have an obvious agenda. We want to entertain Georgia fans around a topic that we all have some sort of shared worldview on. This is clearly a pro-Georgia show. There's no doubt about that. But while we have bias and agenda and things like that, we try to be as open about that as we possibly can be. But we're not really in the habit of lying about anything. And so I'm going to give you in a moment the full context here, because the easiest thing in the world would be some sort of partisan hack that does sort of like one-sided fact checks. But we're not necessarily going to do that. We're going to try to be as fair and balanced as we possibly can related to what the Clemson player named Walker Parks said yesterday. Now, once again, in the habit of trying to be as honest as we possibly can, the guy from Clemson comes across as kind of a good dude. Apparently he's dealt with some injuries, fought back to get on the football field, seemed to show a lot of perseverance in doing that. So he had like this 20-minute press conference up on the Clemson site yesterday. And as I said before, does not come across as a bad guy, does not come across as some sort of easy villain to make in a situation like that. But it is also fair to point out that the basic text of what he said got a bunch of Georgia fans kind of bothered yesterday. And the clip that you might have seen was really, really short. I do think it's appropriate to kind of give a little bit of a longer clip because it does give a little bit of extra context. I don't think it necessarily changes the overall meaning of it, but it's at least our attempt to be, as I said before, not the sort of partisan hack that does one-sided fact checks, but the kind of person that, tries to give you the full context for everything that's going on. So this is a Clemson player named Walker Parks, very happy with the performance of his offensive line against an overmatched Appalachian State team on Saturday, apparently thinking, hey, man, maybe we could have just done this against Georgia too. This is what Walker Parks said yesterday.
Thing is, I've never had a doubt in this team, and that's what it's going to sound insane. I don't mean this in any disrespectful way at all, because I have a lot of respect for them. They whooped us, but I feel like we could have done that to Georgia as well. And I'm not saying hang 66-20 and do all that, but the plays that we made, the plays were there, the opportunities were there.
So once again, that's a slightly longer clip than the one that maybe, or some of the ones that have been shared on social media about all of this. But the part that still matters is the part that everybody else has pulled out. He's like, hey, what we did to Appalachian State, I think we should have done that to Georgia. Now, he caveats it by saying no disrespect intended, but I think most of us have lived long enough to know that when someone says, hey, no disrespect, what's about to follow could be interpreted as disrespectful. And I think that Georgia fans are well within their rights to be disrespected or feel disrespected by the Clemson dude fresh off an absolute drubbing to the point where I didn't know if even Clemson would show up and play any more football games. Should have been ashamed, should have been humiliated, an absolute drubbing at the hands of Georgia. All of a sudden now Clemson gets one win, and they're right back to say, hey, we want Georgia. We want a rematch. And listen, as I said before, like, honestly, I don't want to make a villain out of this Walker Parks dude. I don't really know him. Like many Clemson players, it seems like he's going to go pro in something other than football. So I don't want to make like a big thing out of him because I don't know that we just don't typically do that. We don't make an enemy out of players, no matter who they play for. Typically speaking, that's just kind of not what we do. But I do think it is a very strong tale. And I'm sorry, this does matter to me. When a guy like this can live in such a delusional world of, gosh, what we did against Appalachian State worked so well. We should have been able to do that against Georgia too. Like, that is one of those things that I do think has some meaning. And the meaning here goes beyond just one Clemson player kind of living in a dream world about how the game against Georgia could have been different. Because here is the one thing I think with the exception of Florida, some of their players have a little bit of a history of saying some pretty crazy stuff. But with the exception of Florida, who's kind of its own, kind of weird entity unto itself, you don't hear nonsense like this from the rest of the SEC. You just don't. You don't. And, Georgia gets a lot of big wins against a lot of teams. There's a lot of hatred here and a lot of rivalries. And there's a lot of talking before the game. Now, you get all kinds of stuff like that. A lot of chirping, a lot of chattering before the game. But you rarely get any kind of talking after the game. You rarely get what you got from the Walker Parks dude here, which is, hey, man, we should have beaten Georgia as bad as we beat Appalachian State because look how good we played against Appalachian State. You don't get that in the SEC because the SEC just requires a level of realism that the ACC doesn't require. And this is why the Walker Parks statement matters beyond just the fact that some, guy that very few people in our audience have ever heard of is kind of trying to have revisionist history for the game for Georgia against Clemson. This is sort of the problem that plagues college football overall, is that if you are Clemson, you get to live in a dream world. And the dream world you get to live in is that you're right next to the SEC. And so therefore, as a team that has been near the top of the ACC, you get to think that you're just like the SEC. That's the dream world, right? Is that, well, we're on top of the ACC. Geographically, we're the closest league to the SEC. We're essentially all basically the same. And college football as a sport has bent over backwards to try to propel that lie as an accepted reality for the rest of the fans. Like, the one thing that college football desperately does not want to be is a regional sport. College football does not want to be a sport that's really, really popular in the Deep South and certain portions of the industrial Midwest. Like, that's not what college football wants to be. It wants to avoid that at all costs. And so, therefore, there is this inflated sense of importance of what the ACC is, what the Pac-12 used to be, even to a degree what the Big 12 sort of is, certainly the Big 10, Notre Dame year after year there as well, not in a conference. But this idea that college football is a national sport. And yeah, the SEC might have seemingly the best teams, but the truth is they're all basically the same. And every conference, or at least most conferences, have their shot at the college football playoff. College football has worked very hard to kind of propel that obvious lie. I just think it's as obvious of a lie as you can possibly have. And I don't think you can fault guys like Walker Parks for kind of believing that, because he came to Clemson, I'm presuming, because he had been seeing Clemson win for a good number of years. He's been a part of mostly winning seasons during his time there at Clemson. And so when Clemson loses to Georgia 34-3, well, I guess he could be forgiven for being like, well, man, this is such an anomaly based on my previous college experience that this is probably weird. If we played the game again, it wouldn't be quite so weird. Maybe we would be the team on the side of a 34-3 beatdown. But the reason why we know that Parks is living in a dream world by thinking that way is, and listen, I don't brag on myself very much, but you can go back and listen to the tape. several times prior to the playing of this game, I told you that Georgia would win this game by 30 or 40 points. Exactly what Georgia did, because it's obvious that Clemson, from a talent perspective, from a competitive edge perspective, Clemson and Georgia just don't play on the same level. Georgia is in a stratosphere, they're on a plane that Clemson just can't seem to get to here right now, both because of the physical abilities of the players they're recruiting and the competitive edge that they have refined for themselves by only playing the kind of midland, mediocre opponents that an ACC schedule is going to provide you. Is that Walker Parks, I think, has the kind of delusion that can be conjured up when you don't know what you don't know, and when all you do is play the typical ACC teams, you really have no idea of what your measuring stick is in comparison to the best of college football, because the ACC is so far removed from the best of college football that you just don't really have a very appropriate frame of reference. And if we're being honest here, the sort of crazy talk like this, doesn't it sound a little bit like some of the crazy talk we've also heard over the course of the last year from Florida State, that somehow Florida State on the basis of winning the ACC, all of a sudden they're a big bad boy program sitting at the same dinner table that the best of the SEC sit at? Like, doesn't the crazy stuff coming from Clemson sound like the crazy stuff that also comes from Florida State? These are programs that live in a dream world. They are, they just live in a dream world because they've compared themselves to the typical ACC programs that are nowhere close to the same type of stature. And the reason why you don't hear this sort of thing in the SEC is because the measuring stick is so much more rigorous. We talked about this yesterday, the fact that Georgia's getting ready to play 8 straight SEC opponents. And it kind of creates a weird irony that Georgia's the one that beat Clemson 34-3, but from the moment the game ended, Georgia hasn't bragged about that at all. And here we are 2 weeks later. Apparently some dude from Clemson is still talking about the Georgia game because, frankly, there's just not that much else to talk about when you're an ACC program like Clemson. But on the flip side of that, Georgia knows the real test wasn't a top 15 ranked Clemson opponent in a neutral site. It's everything else that Georgia's about to play. And the reason why we know this is true is because over the course of years, Kirby Smart has said this over and over and over again. Let me give you an example. Let's go back to the morning after the national championship game in the 2022 season when Georgia had beaten TCU 65-7. But even in that moment, Kirby Smart wasn't willing to rest on his laurels because he knew that other programs in the SEC were ready to come after him and ready to pull him back down off the perch that he had been on. And that kind of mindset grows in this league because of how hard you're pushed. It does not grow in leagues like the ACC because there's no one capable of doing any pushing. It's Syracuse and Wake Forest and Georgia Tech, ham and egg programs that don't make the front page of the paper. But Kirby Smart knows in the SEC, you don't get that. And this is what he said at the time.
We're not going to be the hunted now, I'm telling you. That doesn't mean we're going to win them all. It doesn't mean we're going to always get it right. I'm humble enough to know that humility is a week away. And I learned that at an early age, humility is always a week away.
So in the SEC, that's the mindset that you live with. That humility can be a week away from striking us and from embarrassing us if we're not ready. If you're some guy named Walker Parks playing for Clemson, you don't live with the mindset that humility is a week away because no one in the SEC is capable of pushing you that hard. It's just not the world that you live in. But what we see from Georgia is when it can step outside the boundaries of the SEC, where the humility can always strike if you're not ready for it. When Georgia's playing the likes of Clemson, they're winning 34-3. Or the previous, 6 non-conference ranked Power 4 opponents they beat prior to that, all by an average of 30-something points, blowout city against TCU and against Oregon, against Michigan, and on you go in terms of these games for Georgia against ranked non-conference Power 4 opponents. Not only are they all Georgia wins, they're for the most part all Georgia blowout wins because of the way in which Georgia has readied itself for competition because of the rigor of the SEC. So all of this is simply a build-up to this point, which is as we kind of move into a 12-team college football playoff era, it might be easy to assume, well, all of this is fixed. The debate about the college football playoff, which leagues are the best, which teams are the best, That's all fixed because now more teams make the playoff. And I do think it does lessen the severity of each decision the College Football Playoff Selection Committee, has to deliberate on. But the overall lie that governed this sport during the 14 playoff era, to a degree, still exists. That somehow the SEC, well, they may be the best, but only slightly better than the ACC, only slightly better than the Big 12, or slightly better than the Big 10. When you see Georgia beating a team like Clemson 34-3, does it seem like the SEC is slightly better than the ACC, or does it seem like the SEC is so much better than the ACC that the ACC isn't really even worth talking about? To me, it's more the latter. To me, it's more of an issue of the competition is so imbalanced, there's no point even pretending that it is a competition. And so Georgia doesn't do very much pretending. Georgia just simply worries about what's coming next. For Clemson, though, they're left to live in a dream world of, we may have lost this one 34-3, but if we could ever play them again, maybe we'll be the ones that get a chance to do that. But here's the thing. Clemson won't get that rematch against Georgia because they're not good enough to earn it. They'll be in the Gator Bowl or the whatever else because of the fact that they just don't play at Georgia's level. The players on that team don't seem to know that, but that's more of a rebuke about just how, poor Dabo Swinney's leadership has become and just how poor the ACC schedule prepares them for games like the one they just played. It's a dream world, but they seem to be happy in it, so I guess we'll leave them alone and let them enjoy it. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. We're happy you're with us here today, no matter how you get to us. Of course, video, 10 a.m., that's live. Most folks, though, on demand. And the great news is, whichever video platform you favor, Facebook or YouTube or even DawgNation.com, you can go back and find the show and rewatch it at a time that suits you. We're always glad that you do that. Of course, podcasts, Apple, Spotify, everything else. If you're in the Athens area, you may be a listener to Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. We're there for you at noon each and every day. Really happy to have you there on that. And if you're watching on YouTube, always appreciate clicking the like button, letting folks know that you enjoy the show. That's one of the great ways that you can kind of make sure this show gets known far and wide. And we do kind of appreciate that, as self-serving as it might sound. By the way, huge thanks to our friends at Breda Pest Management for being a part of the program here today. When I say a part of the program, I mean a part of the program. Matt's obviously a sponsor for our show here today. But if you're on YouTube, very frequently you'll see Matt Breda representing Breda Pest Management in our comment section, interacting with Georgia fans, mixing it up with the non-Georgia fans, and just generally speaking, having a good time. It's one of the things that fills me with such great pride is that so many of our great sponsors are like just good Georgia fans, college football fans, sports fans, people who are enjoying life and appreciating all that and, supporting the dogs. And it always feels good to me to be able to recommend a company that I know is out there trying to support UGA the same way that so many of the folks in our audience want to. And in the case of Breda Pest Management, of course that's true. They're the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics. That means if you were in Sanford Stadium this past Saturday, you can look around and know that venue protected from bugs and critters and termites and everything else because of the work that Breda Pest Management does. Breda is also a big part of our high school football coverage each and every week. They're just really dedicated to serving sports fans and sports fans just like you and our audience there as well. And when you make the switch to Breda Pest Management, you're going to put more money back in your pocket just for making that decision. I mean, the fact of the matter is, whether it's being talked about in the news enough or not, everything in life seems to be getting more expensive. And the kinds of folks that I know and spend time talking to and talking about life with, that's the thing we're always talking about is what can we do to make the cost of living a little bit more manageable? And saving money where you can is obviously a huge, huge thing when it comes to all of that. So that's where Breda Pest Management steps in, because when you make the switch to Breda, they're going to put more money back in your pocket just for making that choice. So please find them online. It's BredaPest.com, BREDA, BredaPest.com. Great to have them as a part of DawgNation Daily here today. Loaded show for us. It is the former Dog Davin Bellamy a little bit later on. It's Mike Griffith here coming up in just a minute. Prior to that, though, let's go around the doghouse presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. And Tuesday nights is another opportunity for Georgia to kind of get together some players, Kirby Smart, and there's another presentation to the media. And I call it presentation because, Georgia gets to decide which players come out and speak. Kirby Smart sort of gets to talk about, or I should say he gets to decide what it is he wants to talk about based on the questions that he's asked. And sometimes you sort of detect a little bit of a theme around the message that Georgia wants to send. Obviously, coming into Saturday's game at Kentucky. It'll be the first time that Georgia goes on the road, very different than a neutral site game against a non-conference opponent. The SEC mandates a travel roster. It used to be 70 players, now it's 74, I guess. But it's a reduced roster compared to the home game where you have 8 million people on the sidelines. You're not even allowed to take all your scholarship players to a road game in the SEC. And so the idea of kind of whittling down the travel roster and getting ready for who gets on the bus, or in this case the plane, I guess, to go to Lexington, that was one of the themes that kind of came up last night. And Kirby Smart was asked directly about this, about how do you decide, who goes and what is that kind of final determining factor for who makes this coveted travel roster? And Smart gave a very clear answer to that last night. Here's what Kirby Smart had to say.
Just a numbers game of special teams. I mean, with 74, you're not usually talking about starters. You're talking about a travel roster of guys that are going to be, emergency players, have to go in. You lose somebody. We've been up there before and had, a couple injuries and had to fill in with guys at Kentucky. So probably the 65th to the 74th guy are special teams picks and guys that can play on special teams.
So you hear Kirby Smart say there, if you think about this almost like a golf tournament, there's sort of a cut line here. You got, number 65 guy, he sort of feels like he's above the cut line. If you're the 85th scholarship player, you sort of feel like you're below that. But there is some fluctuation that occurs there. As Kirby Smart says, when you kind of get down there, kind of beyond the offensive and defensive too deep of who makes it, who doesn't, who travels, who stays home, Kirby Smart says all of this comes down to, at the kind of the back end of the travel roster, all of this comes down to how much of a contribution are you capable of making on special teams? That's what Smart says. We know that Kirby talks about special teams, obviously, all the time. And yet, in this particular case, this is more than just lip service. This is more than just talk. This is something for him that does truly matter. This was verified yesterday by one of the Georgia players who does travel to games like this because of the contribution he makes on special teams, a guy who starts a number of the Georgia special teams units, Cole Speer. His normal offensive position is wide receiver, but he's a major contributor right now to Georgia's special teams. And he reinforced yesterday that it's not just Kirby in press conferences talking about this, so he doesn't have to say something more interesting. Behind the scenes there as well, Kirby's also talking about that notion of special teams quite a bit. This is what Cole Speer said about that yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, he's not going to take it light at all. He's going to push every single person on the field to be better on every 4 special teams, no matter what you're doing. And he takes a big pride in that. And, I take pride in it, and I think it's a big part of the game and can change momentum and can really affect the game in a big way, and he thinks so too. So I think all the younger guys should buy into it.
So when we think about Georgian special teams this year, a couple of things come to mind. Georgia's very good at making field goals. That's been kind of the way of the world for the Dogs for quite a bit. It seems like with Anthony Evans, they probably have a more exciting punt returner than maybe any time in the Kirby Smart era. So that's the stuff that's easily noticed. But let me give you kind of one more thing to think about as it relates to this. We talked about the Georgia-Clemson game a moment ago. One of the reasons why Georgia's win against Clemson was so dominant is because of what Georgia was doing to kind of create long fields for Clemson to try to drive on offensively. That it was a good day for the Georgia defense, but that good day for the Georgia defense was sort of made even more successful, and frankly, success was made easier because of the fact that over and over again, Clemson seemingly was having to start on a longer field, deeper field position in their own territory than what Georgia was being asked to do. And that's the sort of little thing that makes a big difference. So I know this may seem a little bit tedious. I know this may seem not quite as exciting as an explosive play offensively or a negative play produced defensively, but let me give you something to watch for on Saturday, especially in light of the fact that weather could be a factor, that wind and rain could be a factor. I want you to simply watch, where does Clemson begin its drives? Is it beginning somewhere on the other side of the 30, the 20-something yard line? Are they having to go 70 and 80 yards with regularity? If so, against a defense like this, scoring is likely very hard to come by. But if somehow, some way, either because of turnovers or because of some sort of special teams breakdown, if all of a sudden Kentucky is starting on a shorter field, an offense that really struggled last week against South Carolina, all of a sudden, even against a very good Georgia defense, the task just gets easier. So if you want the game within the game, in some respects, this is sort of it for me. How long of a field can a team like Georgia make a team like Kentucky have to drive on? And what job can the special teams do to kind of help make that happen? We've already seen Brett Thorson's a terrific punter. When called upon to punt, he really booms it. And last year, Georgia didn't give up any punt return yards all season, right? That was the number that always got talked about. Well, in a game like this against Kentucky, where Kirby's already given the warning, we expect it to be physical, we expect it to be tough. In light of that, the longer the field the opposing offense has to travel to find a scoring situation, the easier it gets. That's the kind of sort of hidden thing that could end up mattering in a pretty big way there on Saturday. It was certainly heavy on the minds of Georgia coach Kirby Smart and some Georgia players last night. And that is Around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at our Georgia Farm Bureau. Always love to have Georgia Farm Bureau as a part of what we're doing here because, look, the fact is Georgia Farm Bureau understands that insurance is a little bit of a fact of life. Like for the car that you drive, legally you have to have it. And so therefore, if you have to have it, then you're probably thinking, well, who is the option or which option is sort of best for me? There are obviously a number of choices here. And one of the things I always enjoy recommending are our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau because in addition to just doing great work and providing quality service around the insurance products they sell, this is also a situation where the folks who are at Georgia Farm Bureau, these are Georgians. They are people that are living and working and kind of cheering on the dogs and following their favorite high school teams, things like that, in communities just like yours all across the great state of Georgia. That means friendly claim adjusters. That means really knowledgeable agents. That means everything that you need to make the best possible decision for the proper coverage for you, your family, and everything that you care about, your home, your automobile, your transportation that helps to get you to and from work every day, or anything else, life insurance even. Georgia Farm Bureau is all over all of that. So I want you to reach out to them, give them a call. 877-404-1050. That's 877-404-1050. You can also find them online, gfbinsurance.com. Check them out and find out why Georgia Farm Bureau is always the home team. All right, so before we're done, it's the great and very, very entertaining and talented former dog Davin Bellamy, a part of our program today. But for now, on everything else, beyond just the special teams that we'll see from Georgia against Kentucky, let's talk about all of that with Mike Griffith here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So we will say hello to Mike Griffith here. Going on the road for the first time is Georgia in SEC play. A little bit of a weird game in that, I think Georgia fans are conditioned to expect a hard-fought game from Kentucky, but Kentucky also looked terrible last Saturday. I mean, you just got to say what it is. They just did not look very good. I have tried to caution folks, Mike, this week that I don't necessarily think that's necessarily a precursor of how this game plays out because this is neither of our first rodeos. We see college football week to week is not always an easy thing to predict. So I guess let's just sort of begin right there. What do you sort of expect at first blush to see from Georgia on the road Saturday night?
Well, that Kirby's going to try to be physical. They're going to want to win that line of scrimmage. They're going to want to wear down Kentucky. They're going to want to get on the board early and put Kentucky in a situation where Brock Vandagriff has to be a throw-first quarterback. That's not his strength. He's a dual-threat guy, similar to Stetson Bennett in that respect, ability to make plays off the run. I don't think he has the weapons, though, Brandon. And this could be a really long night for Brock. But to your point, listening to you talk about special teams earlier, I think that's really, when I look at this Georgia team, I really think that's a winning edge. And they've always been good, but I think they're great. I think they might have the best special teams in the country right now with Brett and Peyton and what you said about Anthony Evans. I mean, he's been remarkably efficient. I'm not sure about the kick return game because I don't think anybody's really scored touchdowns on him yet.
That's a good point.
So we don't really know a lot about who's going to be back there. I guess Etienne's one of the guys that's a candidate for that. I don't know how often. But I think that's huge. I think special teams will be really big, and especially if there's weather in this game, which I've heard a lot of anticipation. We've heard Cody Chafin's former weatherman, now DawgNation team member, tell us that, some of these remnants from a hurricane could be up there. I think it's going to start out slow, and I think that Georgia will pull away. But to your point, I do think it'll be physical. I do think it'll be more of a challenge than maybe some people think. I still can't make heads or tails out of what happened with South Carolina, Kentucky, and I don't know if you can either. You saw the same betting I did, and it sure looked like Kentucky be a slam dunk, and they got trounced. So to your point, week to week in the SEC is unpredictable, but I do think this Georgia team will be up for this game. Knowing they have a bye week the following week, I think that helps as well.
Let me also say this. We talk about special teams, and I realize that's not the most exciting conversation for most fans, and probably not for me either. But in the case of Anthony Evans, Mike, one of the things I kind of find to be fascinating is if you really watch just the sport overall, it's very different than what we grew up with, what I grew up with, where like Rocket Ismail is at Notre Dame or some deal like that. Like really exciting punt returns are just not that big a part of college football anymore. Just doesn't really, it hasn't existed at Georgia for a while. I would say it doesn't really exist across much of the rest of college football sort of either. But Anthony Evans sort of feels a little bit like a throwback, where like the 40-something yard return that he had on Saturday to set up Georgia's first touchdown, on the first play from scrimmage because it was a much shorter field. I get the impression that he might be able to give Georgia some of that. He seems to be fearless when it comes to coming up and catching the ball, which is obviously a big part of that, and willing to try to make something happen a little bit too. That I sort of get the impression that Evans may turn into a little bit of a story before it's all said and done. I'm not saying he's going to be Rocket Ismail. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying the way in which that punt return used to be kind of a big part of what college football was about, I sort of think we may talk more about Evans this year than maybe any punt returner that Georgia's had sort of in the Smart era. Do you get that intuition as well?
Absolutely. He's skilled. I mean, if you see how he catches the ball on the run, that's not an accident. Okay, he times it that way. And what that does is it makes it really hard for the people covering punts to really zero in. You see those guys that just stand under and wait for it, and there's three defenders ready to cream him as soon as he catches it. Well, the way Evans does it, it's almost like he times it where he's catching that ball in stride. And it makes it hard for the defenders rushing down the field to know where to set up, right? I mean, you think about it. They're taking an aim point 2 yards downfield where he's standing, and then he's running up 2 steps and catching it. And that's really hard because those guys that are coming down there, they're not looking, they can't see the ball. Their backs are to the ball. So what we're seeing is a skilled punt returner. This is a guy who is skilled at this. And then, of course, once he catches it, he has the juice and the electricity and the tackle breaking ability. And then you presuppose, that with all the quality Georgia puts out there, you've got guys that block really well. So I think you're onto something. I think he'll be one of the top punt returners in the country. Knock on wood, he stays healthy. That's obviously a position where there's a lot of big collisions, but the way he does it makes it really hard for the punt defend team to really zero in on him and be in position to make a tackle when he catches the ball.
The other kind of interesting thing for me about Saturday's game is, Jamon Dumas-Johnson was a former very important part of Georgia's defense. Brock Vandagriff was a former 5-star quarterback. And yet, Georgia playing them on Saturday, there just doesn't seem to be any juice to that storyline at all. And I think that's partially a credit to the fact that, JDJ and Vandagriff seem to have left Georgia in a pretty classy way. I think it's a testament to the fact that I think both players still have a lot of friends on this Georgia roster. I think we're all kind of preparing ourselves for the fact that Georgia may be playing against a lot of former Georgia players in future years, just because that's just sort of the nature of college football here these days. But I think a lot of us maybe assumed there'd be more talk about former players on the other side for Saturday, but it's Wednesday, Mike, and there's just no real teeth to that story here right now. It is a fact, and I guess it's somewhat intriguing, but it doesn't seem to be growing, to mix 1,000 metaphors, it does not seem to be growing very many legs here right now in terms of the kind of thing that people are really talking about beyond just the sort of obvious media questions about it.
Yeah, I mean, these are two former team leaders. I mean, JDJ was at the heart of a 2022 defense, and Brock was one of the most popular guys on the team. So in that sense, there really isn't any animosity from the Georgia players towards them. And then on their side, they don't really have a lot they can say. I mean, they really got shellacked. I mean, that was one of the more shocking results of the year, to see Kentucky dominated at home like that by a South Carolina team that struggled by Citadel. I don't know what to make of that. It's still curious. It's unfortunate for Brock that he doesn't have a supporting cast there. But he wanted to go somewhere and start, and that's understandable. He graduated from Georgia, and Carson was going to be the guy this year, and he didn't want to wait one more year. He wanted to have a couple years at a place. So who knows? Maybe next year, Kentucky grows up around him, or I don't even know. Maybe Mark Stoops won't even be the head coach. I'm not real sure. But to your point, that storyline isn't quite the same as maybe when Georgia has faced other former players.
So after this Saturday, and this is always weird to me how this happens, and we see it every year. You realize, Mike, after this Saturday, the regular season's a quarter of the way done. Like, you just blink your eye, and you've got 25% of the regular season data all accumulated. And that means we'll have seen a little bit from Georgia and a little bit from these teams that Georgia's competing with. I think the Alabama trip to Wisconsin on Saturday is going to be a pretty interesting data point, for instance. Mm-hmm. We've gotten interesting data points from Texas beating Michigan, from Tennessee beating NC State badly. And we know, as has been talked about this week, a lot of those teams now will be a part of a stretch of 8 consecutive conference games here for Georgia. Really tough, rigorous run through the SEC is on its way here. Based on the information you have, having seen Georgia twice and having seen the rest of the country now twice and getting a chance to see everybody again this upcoming Saturday there as well, how ready do you think Georgia is for all of this?
Well, I think they're about where they should be. There are certain areas that we've identified that can be better. Certainly, the interior defensive line is an area that we're all watching closely, whether it's the injuries or the young players, or watching Tennessee Tech have success running the ball was somewhat alarming. Clemson had some success in the first half when the game was still in the balance. So I don't know if you fix that. I think that's one of those areas of the team that's going to have to get better as the season progresses. I think Carson Beck, even though the numbers have been really impressive, I think we would agree that this guy's capable of being even sharper and even better. And you get the feeling that maybe he's going to grow into the chemistry with that receiving core as the season progresses. That should get better and better and better. A lot of questions have been answered, though. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel better about the secondary than I could have imagined. I mean, KJ Bolden has exceeded all of my expectations. Those corners look pretty doggone good to me. Linebacker play has been solid, but not sensational. I've seen a few more missed tackles there than we're accustomed to at that position, but still good. And when Mykel Williams was healthy, he was absolutely the impact player and top 10 draft pick we projected. Offensive line has been as advertised. Running backs have been good. And I think wide receivers have been decent. I don't know how much more we could really ask. There's not a Ladd McConkey out there. There's not a Brock Bowers. But these are guys that are catching the ball. We're not seeing a lot of drops. And I think the runs after the catch have been adequate. So, and as I said, special teams to me is maybe the best special teams unit in the country. I don't think we can undersell that. I'm with you. A lot of people, that's not the most sexy topic, but man, there's a lot of yards. And if you go back to 2021 and look at the field position advantages Georgia had a lot to do with Georgia's national championship run. So I think they're about where they need to be. I don't think there's any panic buttons, no alarms going off. I will say Texas did look very good. I will say that in our AJC SEC power rankings, Georgia is no longer a unanimous number one. There are some people that are voting Texas number one. It's fluid. It's a beauty contest. It doesn't really matter. It does seem the SEC, Brandon, has separated into upper class, middle class, and lower class, according to this poll. The top 6 should be pretty obvious. I think Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss, Tennessee, and Missouri. And then you settle into a middle class with your LSUs, Texas A&Ms, Arkansas. Who else am I missing in there? Believe it or not, Vanderbilt is in that middle section. The lower 4 of South Carolina's middle class. The lower 4, Auburn, Florida, Mississippi State, Oklahoma also middle class. So I'm seeing 3 distinct levels right now. Now, who knows? South Carolina went from 16 to like number 9. Which, because they won and they're undefeated. There's not a lot of undefeated teams. Not everybody's undefeated. Teams have losses. So it's interesting to see how the SEC is shaking out. I do think as the season progresses, there's room for movement because there's so many transfers and it takes longer in some programs for these transfers to become effective than others. So it's been an interesting season. I think Georgia's still in pretty good shape. I feel like they're pretty good. I feel like they can be better, which is exciting that they're number one. And we're sitting here saying, oh yeah, there's room for improvement. And I think this weekend will be one of those steps forward for the Bulldogs.
So we're near the end of our time, and I want to be respectful of your time there as well. And I don't want to pick a fight because we're having a very nice conversation. But people in the comment section are telling me that you ranked Texas ahead of Georgia. Did you really do that?
I did.
Why?
I did this week. Yeah, because they looked better last week, and it's a week-to-week poll. I thought Georgia looked like the best team in the country in week 1. I thought that second half of Clemson looked like a national championship team. But when I saw Tennessee Tech go for over 100 yards rushing, it was a red flag. But beyond that, It was really more about what Texas did. Texas looked outstanding. That looked like the Texas team that beat Alabama by 10 points last year in Tuscaloosa. The run game, the pass game, the defense, the team speed. Now that's week 2. I don't know what Texas is going to look like this week, but last week they looked better than Georgia on Saturday. Texas looked better against Michigan than Georgia did against Tennessee Tech. This is a week-to-week poll. This isn't a pick to say who do you think is going to win it all, or even who do you think is going to win the Georgia-Texas game. I'm still a firm believer Georgia is going to go into Texas and beat the Longhorns by double digits. But that's not what a poll is to me. Now, some people vote differently. Some people say, well, this is how I think it's going to finish at the end of the year every week. That's not how I do it, because I still think Georgia is going to win the SEC championship. But based on last week's games, I thought Texas looked better than Georgia last Saturday.
All right, Mike, good stuff. We'll leave it there for right now. We'll see you later on this week as a part of Go With the Flow, presented by RS Andrews, making our official picks for all the big games that come up, and obviously plenty more from you at DawgNation.com there as well. Thanks for your time. We'll look forward to talking to you soon.
All right, thanks, BA.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So obviously we want to be respectful of Mike's time. We've also got Davin Bellamy coming up, so I want to keep that moving. And I told y'all yesterday, throughout the week, I'm very impressed with the Texas performance against Michigan. I got no dispute with anybody saying that was a very impressive performance. I would say pound for pound, because what you have in a Georgia-Texas comparison right now is 2 weeks worth of data. You got Texas against Colorado State, Texas against Michigan. You got Georgia against Clemson, Georgia against Tennessee Tech. You probably throw out the Tennessee Tech and the Colorado State, and you just simply look at the 2 games of note. And while I was very impressed with Texas, I think that's a pretty significant statement. I think you're talking about a Michigan team that's also in a process of erosion here. And you can say the same thing about Clemson if you want to, but certainly there is nothing to me that obviously says Texas winning at Michigan is more impressive than Georgia winning in a neutral site against Clemson. And so if Georgia started the season at number 1, I don't see any reason to move them down. That would be my argument there on that. But obviously a lot of this corrects itself as teams like this start to play head-to-head. And in the SEC, that's what you get, as opposed to the watered-down ACC, as we said to begin the show. Now, before we bring on Davin Bellamy, let's go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And there are a lot of moments in which, listen, when it comes to the rough and tumble world of college football or some of the crazy stuff that happens outside of college football, you just sort of want to close your eyes sometimes and say, boy, it'd be great to be at Perfect Day Coco Cay right now. And if you want to be on that beautiful, perfect, private island oasis in the Bahamas, the only way to get there is a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. I literally believe that the other cruise lines, other sailing vessels, I'm not even sure they even have the coordinates for how to get there. The latitude and the longitude, I'm not even sure they know how to get there. But Royal Caribbean knows how to get there because they're sailing there all the time. And that is what the fun is all about when you're talking about being on a great ship like Utopia of the Seas and all of that experience. Jessica Slater can tell you all about that. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. If you're watching a video, you see the great crew, staff members on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. They're the ones that make it so much fun. They're the folks that do the task of remembering your name, remembering what you like, how to take care of you, just always so friendly and kind. Such a warm, welcoming environment. That's what Royal Caribbean's all about. So be a part of all the really great, fun things going on when it comes to Utopia of the Seas and the best of Royal Caribbean. All right, a couple of notes here before we bring on Davin Bellamy. First of all, game we have not talked very much about as of yet, but boy, what a fascinating one it is for Saturday. Texas A&M, fresh off a loss to begin the season, comes to Florida, take on, as we like to call them, the lousy, stinking Gators. And we know because of the concussion protocol that Graham Mertz was in, opened the door last week for DJ Lagway, the impressive freshman quarterback, to get some run against Samford. And now Billy Napier has told us that DJ Lagway will now have a role for Florida the rest of the season. They'll play both quarterbacks. Graham Mertz, who honestly is not terrible, DJ Lagway, who even as a noted Gator hater, I'll openly acknowledge that Lagway looks like a pretty good quarterback prospect. So Florida going to try to play kind of a 2-quarterback system here, it would sound like, in a game that they are slightly favored to win over Texas A&M as Aggies make the long travel. Y'all, this is just what we get in this league. This thing where, A&M in the early going here sort of fighting to save its season, Florida and case of Billy Napier might be fighting to save his job. And in some respects, we're about to find out. Is Lagway just a good player with some promise for potential in the future? Or is he the kind of player that can sort of change the game in a winnable game against Texas A&M on Saturday? Like, this is really good drama. And it's a little bit like the Miami game for Florida in that I still think that as the season progresses, wins are going to be hard to come by. That when you have one of these sort of narrow point spreads, at least remote possibility of winning, if you don't grab that, then you run the risk of like 8, 9, or maybe even 10 losses before the season's done. There is good drama in Gainesville on Saturday when it comes to that. Pretty good drama in Columbia, South Carolina there as well. We've talked about the South Carolina side a number of times now. The fact that they do win against Kentucky and get sort of the surprising win, and I'll get a chance to have game day in their building on Saturday. But the LSU side of this continues to be interesting. And the things that Brian Kelly is saying about what LSU wants to do to sort of shore itself up on defense. Isn't it interesting here for a moment that go back to a couple of years ago as a freshman, Harold Perkins sort of felt like one of the real impact players in the SEC. But for now, he just sort of feels like a little bit of a guy, right? He's playing inside linebacker now. He's not getting the same number of, negative plays and big stops. That's just not quite what he's getting. You almost wonder before it's all said and done, can he make another big impact in a game like this? And for a guy like Blake Baker, the defensive coordinator, big bucks to leave a preseason top 10 team like Missouri to come over here to LSU, but really no impact on that LSU defense at all against USC last Saturday. Once again, you kind of wonder, can he assert himself? I think that if you're watching South Carolina LSU on Saturday, given the struggles of the Gamecocks offense, can this be a day in sort of a big national spot that LSU gets back to playing defense again? If so, against a fairly manageable SEC schedule, they could still save their season. That'll be fun on Saturday. I was going to do something on Notre Dame. Let me just save that for right now. Obviously, we don't want to keep our next guest waiting because it's always a lot of fun there on Wednesdays to have him on the show. So we'll say that was cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And we'll turn our attention now and get ready to bring on the terrific and very entertaining former dog, Davin Bellamy, here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. Davin, we always appreciate your time. We hope you're doing well. Welcome back to DawgNation Daily here today.
Brandon, what's going on, man? Glad to be here.
I always love your conversation, Davin, because you always bring so much to the table. And one of the things that Kirby Smart had been concerned about going back to Monday, and obviously some other folks have pointed this out too, the possibility of bad weather on Saturday, maybe rain, maybe wind. I'm presuming that makes it easier for a defensive player. What is Georgia likely doing if there really is the threat of wet footballs and maybe even windy conditions? How much prior to a game can Georgia do to get ready for something like that?
Right. A lot of preparation, goes into, what we call wet games. And like the great Romeo Cornell, you used to always tell me in Houston, get some shoes that work,
Yeah.
So there are going to be no excuses for slipping and stuff like that. You may see the guys change up the cleats. Usually when you're playing a wet game, you want to use your studs. Those more of the screw-in cleats and not the cleats that, already come with, I don't know what word to say, but the screws already in them. And also you may see a lot of the offensive players not wear sleeves. I know Coach Smart is really big on, the sleeves, the material that, the sleeves has. When they get wet, you start to see a lot of fumbles. So a lot of guys aren't probably going to be wearing long sleeves, and they're probably practicing with a wet ball, through the week, just so the center and the quarterback can get used to that football exchange, when it may be wet. So a lot of small details, go in preparing for a game like this.
So I think what you just said is really interesting because I think a lot of us think about, okay, well, the football's harder to catch, and I'm guessing harder to throw. But as you said, as a defensive player, the offensive player, let's say it's like you're running a route, the offensive player knows where he's trying to run. The defensive players have to respond to the offensive player. So therefore, it's also hard on the defense too, because if you're not sure-footed because of the improper footwear with the really wet, field conditions, all of a sudden you're just slip-sliding around there too, and it becomes as much of a challenge for the defense as we would presume it is with a wet football on the offensive side of the ball too then.
Of course, man, you got to think about, the cornerbacks who have to backpedal and plant, at a moment's notice. That's why they always say get some cleats that work, because if you fall and a bomb goes over your head, there's no excuse. You're on the field. And also, I've played in these games a lot. And as a pass rusher, also trying to turn your toe and really turn the edge. It's tough when it's, wet out there. So a lot of you start to see a lot of guys kind of switch up the way they play. I can speak for the pass rushers. You don't really try to burn the edge with speed, because it's going to be harder to turn the corner. So you may try to beat the guy, by going through him or making an inside move. So a lot of things, go into basically a wet game, and kind of, with the rain, the rain is always basically an equalizer, because mistakes that you wouldn't normally make, that weather, sometimes causes that.
I was talking to one of our other guests a moment ago that, you got Brock Vandagriff at quarterback for Kentucky. You got Jamon Dumas-Johnson, linebacker for Kentucky. Both these guys, former Dogs, I think well liked by their teammates. Really, in the case of Jamon Dumas-Johnson, a big contributor to some very good defenses. And Brock Vandagriff, obviously a guy who was competing to be the starting quarterback. But thus far, there doesn't seem to be a lot of drama around the idea that now they're playing to the other side and get ready to play, against UGA. My guess is in the portal era, we'll see a lot more games like this in the future,
Right.
Almost like pro sports free agency, where you're on one team 1 year, now you're playing for the other side the next year. That's going to become, I'm assuming, more commonplace in college football. From your perspective and trying to put yourself in the position of these Georgia players, how weird do you think it is for them to be playing against their former teammates on Saturday?
You know what? It's not really weird. I can think about when what's the name? I think it was John Abrams was on our team as a freshman and left to go to Mississippi State. And, he ended up making some bulletin board quotes that we were able to use, and, I definitely remember giving the speech before that game and just kind of mentioned how, this guy, he bled with us, he sweated, and he just went through everything, with us to become a Dog. And then he goes over there, and he's over there for a couple of months and says all these things towards the media. And I just remember that getting the guys riled up. I don't think it's really a big deal if the guys don't give them any bulletin board material to add fuel, to the fire. You expect everyone's not going to be able to get on the field at Georgia. And even if they do, the role that they want may not be the role that they imagined. So going into Georgia, the first thing they always say is look to your left and look to your right. 3 years from now, this guy may not be here with you. You kind of understand that, some of your teammates that you come in with may not be there when you leave. But as long as these guys don't say anything, to the media and get any bulletin board, material, it's just a normal Saturday of, Georgia playing to the standard.
So you guys shellacked Mississippi State that day. Jonathan Abrams, who you're talking about there.
We smacked them. We smacked them.
Do you think that stuff, and you obviously using that in a pregame speech, do you think that did add extra fuel to your teammates that day?
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. Me being a leader, you can always read the energy of the room about, you always look in your troops' eyes and see if they're ready to go to war. And when I gave that speech, everyone was just so locked in. I just remember Sony just, staring at me, because I think the quote had something to do with our running game. And I just remember, just using what he said to get our guys going, and just the way that they were looking at me. I kind of knew, especially, we was playing home. It was a night game. We was both 3-0 at the time.
Yeah.
And, it just really got them going. So I definitely think that was a big piece.
That's a great story, Davin. I'm glad you told that. On Saturday, this Georgia team will go on the road for the first time. A lot of these veteran players know what that feels like, but I always think it's weird. I'm obviously not a former player, but I try to put myself in the position of one. When you're on the field, now Kentucky's not as big a stadium as some of the ones that Georgia's going to play in, but still, it's a bunch of people dressed in blue. They're all like trying to get you, riled up. They're cheering wildly if you mess up. They're trying to get you to mess up by making noise. What's that
Right.
like to be a football player and basically have, at least within the confines of that building, it sort of seems like the whole world's out to get you? It's got to be a little bit of a weird feeling for the players who go through that for the first time, because high school football doesn't create that environment the way that college can.
Exactly. Really kind of take what I say with a grain of salt. I love playing at home, but playing on the road, it's kind of it's us against the world. We've traveled here on our boats, not our first class flights
Yeah.
on Delta, but
Yeah.
we try to always say we we try we travel here on a boat, like the Vikings, and we're burning the ships and we're not leaving until we conquer this, mission. So I always love that back against the wall feeling on the road. You got a couple thousand fans in the stands and you're just surrounded by the blue or, just the opposite color. And it just feels like, okay, this is really the man in the arena. No one here wants us to win. Everyone here hates our guts. They're saying some things that we can't repeat on, TV. So
Sure.
just that gets you going. And I know Coach Smart always thrived off of that energy and that rhetoric. He always used to say, we're here on the ships and we're burning the ships, because there's no turning back. So I think that's what goes into a Georgia's player mentality of, being the hunter and not being, the prey. It don't matter where we are, home or away, who's on our side, who thinks we're going to win, how many of you against us. We always think that, we're junkyard dogs and we'll, come out on top. So as far as the freshmen being there who've never experienced that, this always goes back, to culture. Those guys have been ordained in a culture that, people say we set, but I say it was set times, before us. But especially with, Coach Smart, those guys are just so well trained, like Navy SEALs, and they understand they have to go in different environments to complete the mission, and that's all that matters.
I think that's beautifully said, Davin. That is so good. Hey, one more thing before we let you go. Obviously, we saw Georgia get off to a faster start offensively on Saturday. I think for a lot of people, that was kind of a nice thing to see. They also put up a big point total against a ranked Clemson team prior to that. Maybe more asked from this Georgia offense in future weeks. What do you think things stand for UG on that side of the ball? What have you liked? What do you want to see more of as they kind of move into really the most crucial stretch of the season coming up over the course of the next couple of months?
Well, I mean, I think I've seen what, kind of, I expected to see a well-balanced team, a veteran quarterback, who can make all the throws, very efficient. We're not turning over the ball, our turnover to getting turnover, ratio is, amazing right now. And that's the number one stat in winning in pro football and in college football. So I just think, Georgia's always been well balanced. We always play off our, running game. And right now, especially what I've seen last week, we're forming a three-headed monster. So, I mean, it's kind of reminds me of, when I was in school. You got Chubb, you got Sony, you got Swift. Let those guys wear the defense down. And then you got a smart quarterback who's the leader of the team, who gets everyone involved, and he's the point guard, he's the captain of the ship. So just the efficiency and the well balance that Georgia has shown, it's kind of not surprising to me. We always have great defenses. So whenever you have a great defense, you kind of just don't want your offense just to mess it up. Just keep us in the game. But we're just above that because of the quarterback that we have and the weapons that we have. But the one thing I must say is, I'm basically excited to see someone take that next step and being that go-to receiver. Even though, Carson Beck is spreading the love, you still want to see that guy who, is 39, go get it. Kind of like we had Brock last year, and, he's not there. So I just want to see who's going to step up and emerge as that, Mr. Reliable guy.
I think that's really good, Davin. I tell you bring so much to the conversation. We'll look forward to having you a part of our DawgNation pre- and post-game coverage on Saturday, including after the game against the Wildcats, hopefully talking about a Georgia win. Back here again next week on DawgNation Daily there as well. Thanks for your insight. Thanks for those great stories and just a really fun conversation. We'll look forward to doing it with you again very soon.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Brandon. And go Dogs.
Go Dogs indeed. Great stuff from Davin Bellamy. Like, how good is that on a couple of fronts? Hey, as a media person, I can't help but laugh. Do you want to know why players in some cases are so careful not to say anything? Why coaches are coaching the players not to say anything? Because Davin Bellamy says, man, our guy, Jonathan Abram, said like one thing. I grabbed it, and I got it in front of the team, and I'm just screaming this into the faces of these players of, are you going to let him talk that way about y'all? And then Georgia goes out frothing the mouth when they beat Mississippi State that day, 37-3. That's the flea flicker to Terry Godwin, Jake Fromm. Davin sort of tells a story that I don't know that I'd ever heard before of in the locker room, just laying down the law before the start of that game. This is why all the players are always so careful about what not to say, not doing anything to get anybody more fired up than they need to be. Davin Bellamy's story there tells you all about that. And how about the wonderful, wonderful thoughts of, and we all know Davin's kind of an edgy player, and I say that in full compliment, right? I mean, Davin's one of those guys that sort of likes to have a little bit of an edge about the way that he plays the game. So, of course, a guy like that's going to embrace going on the road. Of course, he would like the idea of almost being like the wrestling heel or something like that. Of course he would embrace that. That just sort of feels like what he would like to do. And obviously during his Georgia career at Notre Dame, for instance, we saw him do that so well, like a really, really strong conversation there on a couple of fronts. Now, let me say a couple of things before we get ready to wrap up here today. First of all, we're always so appreciative about having our friends at Dr. Pepper as a part of what we're doing here around DawgNation, and I love Dr. Pepper on game days there as well. Now, Dr. Pepper for me is an everyday type of thing, but around the college football season, of course, you're getting fired up and getting ready to enjoy all of that delicious ice-cold Dr. Pepper as you're watching the game. You know me, though. It's like as soon as the show is done, it's sort of the first thing I'm thinking about. When am I going to get a chance to pop the top and enjoy some Dr. Pepper, because it is a pepper thing, and my fandom for Dr. Pepper goes beyond just college football game day. By the way, speaking of Dr. Pepper, they're also a big part of our DawgNation Invasions this year, the one we did a couple of weeks ago prior to Clemson. Of course, speaking of DawgNation Invasions, we're going to be going to Tuscaloosa in a couple of weeks. Now, we just heard Davin Bellamy say, hey, I know we may have flown in on a jet, but we pretend to be Vikings on a crew on a ship. We pretend like we're invaders from an enemy land. Well, listen, when it comes to the DawgNation Invasion, you got to have the same attitude there as well. You get game face on, ready to take over the Yellowhammer State, both the Friday night party there in Hoover, Alabama, Saturday traveling in luxury motor coach over to Tuscaloosa from Hoover. Big all-inclusive tailgate experience leading into Georgia and Alabama. So the hotel situation for this is going fast. Our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips can help you get booked up on that. So go to DawgNation.com/tailgate for more information on that. DawgNation.com/tailgate for more information on that. And if you just want the tailgate tickets, whether it be the Friday night party or the Saturday kind of pregame tailgate experience from Tuscaloosa, well, they can get you going on that. Or if you want like the full-on travel package, or including even maybe if you'd like to purchase tickets to the game itself, once again, our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips can help you there on all of that. So DawgNation.com/tailgate to get in and get ready to go on all that. That is DawgNation.com/tailgate for more on that. Make sure you check out tonight Before the Hedges, presented by Kroger, 7 p.m., the brand new start time for that. Not quite as new anymore, but it is a consistent start time for that show. Really good stuff. Jeff Sintel looking at defensive line for recruiting along with Kaylee Manziel. What to expect there on that side of the ball with that position group. Strong stuff from Jeff Sintel on that. And by the way, amazing subscriber growth for us as of late on the YouTube side of things. So thank you so much for subscribing to DawgNation on YouTube, for liking our stuff. Some of y'all know I don't do the sort of self-promotion thing very naturally very much. I just don't do that, but it obviously does help us so much. When you find our content, when you're a part of what we do around here, I really, really appreciate that. So thank you for the continued growth you've allowed us to have here at DawgNation. So thankful for all that. And thankful for a great golden shoe submission today. So a little bit of a backstory here. Ran into a great Georgia fan at the game on Saturday from Gainesville, my hometown. So great to see this. Now, I want you to look at these pictures here for a moment. How about the picture here of Herschel Walker going back to a signing day? This is the not National Signing Day, but the autograph day, fan day, picture day that I've talked about before, being loving and being kind of a part of and enjoying all of that. Great Georgia fan named Rusty Jessup. Rusty's from Gainesville, my hometown. And so he wrote in to say that I bumped into the game on Saturday, and he sent me these pictures. I mean, don't these pictures look like something from a museum? Like, didn't every single one of us have the one Georgia hat with like the dog face logo? You love the kind of the bent bill, which was sort of a thing back in the 80s. Really cool T-shirts. Like, this is like vintage stuff now that would be worth hundreds of dollars, but it was just like clothes back then. Just brings back so many terrific memories. I'm a little too young to have been there for a Herschel Walker picture day, but you see the Georgia fans having a great time. Like, these pictures are truly priceless, and Rusty shares some great stories there on that. So we'll give him a golden shoe on that. That is really terrific stuff. We appreciate Rusty sharing that, obviously representing my hometown of Gainesville, which is always a great thing there as well. Lousy, stinking Gators, no fun pictures for them. It's a pretty bleak picture of a program in decline, and 1,404 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. It's our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can always trust them on all of that. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get your comments here across all platforms. Let me start on Facebook here for a moment because I'm just crazy like that sometimes, and we hope you're all doing good. By the way, did I see this right? Our buddy Steve Schaffini is checking out the show as he's flying right now. That's always really nice. Philip Wells says if there's no rain at all, dogs by 30 for sure. Hope that's the case. I tell you, though, as I mentioned yesterday, I got that little gnawing thing about the fact that these are not the typical games which Georgia's typically at its best at. There's a fairly established, I think, template for like when we know we're going to see Georgia, kind of frothing in the mouth and when they might not be. This just sort of feels like a get in and get out type of game for me, but we'll see. We'll see. Let's see what else. Chris Tittle says, is there a kickoff game for Dogs and Tide? Yeah, that's a night game. Yeah, we know that's going to be a night game. Night game on ABC, I believe. Let's see what else. Steve Schaffini says, what do you guys think? 23.5 is a lot of points, especially with the rain, but Kentucky also looks stir-fried. So here's one of those deals where I am very big on like contrarian college football takes. I just think that conventional wisdom often proves to be wrong, but it's not always wrong. So in other words, this is why college football is so much fun. I am generally conditioned to believe Georgia's riding high. Kentucky played bad last week as anybody could. I am generally conditioned to believe a little bit of an overvalue of Georgia, a little bit of a market correction on Kentucky. That's the way that all markets work. Because if it didn't, they wouldn't be markets. You know what I'm saying? It's like, there is a degree to which predicting a football game is a little bit like predicting a stock going up. Now, they're also slightly different in some respects too. But if all we had to do is look at past performance to get the future results, we'd all be billionaires. Now, if inflation keeps on going, we will all be billionaires, but we won't be able to buy a carton of eggs. But that's a different topic for a different day. But you can't just look at the past to determine the future. If we could, any idiot could predict the future, and obviously we know that's not the case. So there are these little market corrections that just sort of show up in like regular, business markets, in the sort of manufactured market around sports gambling. There are just market corrections that occur. There's a little bit of a heat check, if you will. I'm conditioned to believe that Saturday sort of feels like it could be one of those type of games. But obviously, if contrarian thinking was always right, then it wouldn't be contrarian anymore. And so therefore, you do have to also be on guard for the fact that, like the old saying goes, when somebody tells you what they are, believe them. maybe Kentucky last week just told us what it is. Not very good. And maybe it is our job just to believe them. John Paul Williams says, are there any DawgNation tailgate plans for Georgia, Florida? So he says it'll be my first game in Jacksonville, for a game anyway. So I don't believe we have an official DawgNation invasion to Jacksonville plan, but the last few years I've hung out with the folks from the Bulldog Club of Jacksonville. They do a great tailgate. This is not an ad, but they are good people. Plenty to drink, plenty to eat, wonderful spot. I've kind of hung out with them. My guess is I'll probably do some of that again here. So if you like good Georgia people, I mean, that Bulldog Club of Jacksonville is one of the biggest anywhere. So like I said before, I've kind of hung out with them a little bit. I'm guessing we may do some hanging out with them again this year there as well. So yeah, that's kind of the deal there on that. But also, we've also tried to kind of move around the stadium a little bit and try to say some folks there too. Sam Burke says, I mainly want to see our defense pitch a shutout or hold them under 10 points. Yeah, I mean, I do think obviously this is, wishing and hoping, but I do think if Georgia were to keep Kentucky out of the end zone the same way it's kept the previous two opponents out of the end zone, I think we could be kind of getting back to that stinginess on defense that does define the best of Georgia. I do think there'd be something to that. I do. Randy Hall also wanting a defensive score from Georgia. Maybe we'll get that as well. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a minute. DT, enjoying Davin Bellamy. Yeah, the feedback on Davin has been universally pretty positive, which I love. Let's see what else. I'm trying to some very interesting conversation going here at DawgNation.com. Dave Snow says the Georgia defensive line should feast on Saturday. I saw some of the Kentucky-South Carolina game, and Brock Vandagriff was literally under duress almost immediately. That is true. Literally would get snapped and be running. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think I've said this a couple times on the air, it certainly seems like the only potential mitigation against that is like the old school, like we saw like Kent State do to Georgia back in 2022. A couple of teams have done this, where it's like snap it, get rid of it, and just try to get something going. Like, get the ball out of the quarterback's hand, get the ball out of the middle of the field, get over towards a boundary, try to make somebody miss, and maybe do something that way. And if it is wet footing, try to take advantage of the fact that, maybe a Georgia defender slips and slides or something like that, as Davin was just describing to us. K-Dog says, what's your opinion on Brock Vandagriff? So my opinion on Vandagriff is I always thought he was a good player in high school. And I always thought that Vandagriff got a little bit of a bad knock for that one game he played against Gunnar Stockton, where like Stockton had the Rabun County talent and, Vandagriff had the Prince Avenue talent. And I thought that Rabun County was just a better team. And so therefore I think it made Stockton look better in that game. But I thought that Vandagriff showed some things in a kind of a nationally televised type game that was pretty impressive. And so I always thought that eventually Vandagriff was going to have a chance to win the Georgia starting quarterback job. And he did have a chance. He had a chance in 2023, and Beck just beat him out. I think one of the things that kept Vandagriff in that competition, Mike said this earlier, and my understanding is from people that I've talked to, this is 100% true, is that Vandagriff was really popular with a lot of Georgia players. He had kind of like the sort of Pied Piper type thing of good quarterbacks have. Like, I think he was involved, not to get in people's personal business, but kind of involved in like the FCA. A lot of guys go to like the FCA with him, and just kind of a respected teammate. And I think that was sort of it. I think ultimately Vandagriff may be better suited in a little bit different offense than the one Georgia runs for 1,000 different reasons. So Vandagriff's best chance to play may have always been somewhere else. I think a lot of people thought he was going to Auburn. The fact that he didn't, maybe that makes him a DGD just because he didn't go to the Georgia rival. He went to a Georgia opponent, but not a Georgia rival. Maybe that's the deal here. So I'm pretty pro Vandagriff. I really am. Like it's pretty easy for me to root for him every day other than Saturday. For instance, when I found out last week he had a bad game, and I do think you have to put some of that on him. His offensive line is struggling, but, I mean, if you watch the full game, I think you saw moments in which Vandergrift probably wasn't helping the situation either. When he had a bad game last Saturday, I was disappointed because, you know, it's like there are just some guys you intuitively sort of root for, and there are some guys you sort of intuitively root against. Vandergrift is someone that I intuitively just sort of root for, and I was disappointed that he did not have a good game last week. I hope he has a bad game on Saturday, and then I hope he plays good or plays well the rest of the way. Trippy Charlie says dogs could name their score, but Kirby may just want to play it vanilla, just get out with a win and not show Bam any more than necessary. Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to be flippant, but I believe that Trippy Charlie is probably right, that injured players, if they're on the fence, they're staying on the bench. Game plan, not much more than you need. You know, it is just sort of a get in and get out type of game. And in a 16-game season, which for Georgia could be, and could even be, I guess, longer than that, but probably 16 games if Georgia is at its absolute best, there may be a lot of those games here this year. I mean, I think we're still kind of making sense of what a 16-game schedule, a 12-team playoff, what it kind of does to the sort of week-to-week competition. We may see a good number of games that perhaps play like that. Let me go to YouTube and get some folks over there. I saw some very funny stuff on YouTube a little earlier. You just sort of never know what people are going to be talking about, but you should also know, even when I'm in the middle of doing the show, sometimes I'm watching. I was definitely watching some of that a little earlier. K-Shad says it was great to see Branson Robinson's running more aggressive last week. He looked more comfortable, which is a good sign for the Dogs. I was also so happy for him for finding the end zone. I mean, y'all know this to a certain extent, but I think it's still easy to not always fully appreciate this. Like, getting injured really must stink. Like, it's just got to be terrible. And you've got to have these, you know, stories in your mind of, well, can I ever get back again to being what I once was? Like, last year, I was sort of battling an injury for a little while. And for a while, I was worried. It's like, man, is this just my new life now? Like, is this just what life is? Well, thankfully, eventually I got better. But, you know, if you're a football player, you think about that even more because your livelihood, like my injury was kind of a quality of life thing. It made swinging a pitching wedge a little harder, but I'm not making money off my athleticism. You know, if you're a football player, you're connected to that. And so coming back from injury, you know, these guys sometimes make it look easy, but spiritually, it's not an easy thing to necessarily do. But it looks like Branson's in the process of doing that, which I love. Jonathan Aaron asked, do you think we'll have Hall and Williams back for Alabama? I would invite you to go back and check out what Kirby Smart said, last week about Jordan Hall. That was very hopeful, I thought. Very hopeful. And that could be really good news. In the case of Mikkel, I certainly hope that's the case because I do believe the best version of Georgia requires Mikkel Williams. I certainly hope that's the case. Colby Straughter wondering if there are any players from the Kirby Smart era who are coaching yet. Let's think about this. I don't know that. I mean, they're like Montgomery Van Gorder did not play at Georgia, but he would have been a player during the Smart era who is coaching now. But that's not what you're asking. You're asking about guys who've been at Georgia. Not that I can think. Oh, yeah. By the way, good to have Cody Chaffins just dropping him out of the sky. Yeah, what is Warren Erickson doing? Oh, yeah, he's at Georgia. That's right. So Warren Erickson's there. Thank you, Cody. That's great. Warren Erickson's there. That's right. So that's your answer, Warren Erickson. There you go. That's good. Let's see what else. Spencer Clark asked about Paul Moon. I think Paul Moon said he wasn't going to be here. I believe he said that. Foster Moss says, did you see Hugh, as he calls him, Hugh Sleaze, playing the blame game and throwing Peyton Thorne under the bus? Yeah, he threw him under the bus now. There's no doubt about that. What would he say? He said we had one bad coaching call. Everything else was on the players, on Thorne. I hate to be this way because we don't obviously do that with players, but, I mean, to a certain extent, it just sort of is what it is. Auburn made the decision not to upgrade at quarterback. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. I think for Auburn, on the basis of what I saw against Cal, to me it seems fairly obvious that this is sort of turning into a little bit of a trust the process year for Auburn. I think they're content to be bad. I do. And I think that next year they're going to make a run to try to be like 9-3, which could maybe turn into 10-2. I think we see a very different version of Auburn next year than we're seeing this year. Hugh Freeze is not on the hot seat. Auburn is recruiting too well for that to be true. They've got NIL dollars. This was one of those situations where when Brian Harsin was the coach, and by the way, Harsin had a really – we need to probably do this on the show. Harsin had a really funny message the other day, essentially mocking Auburn for not winning. But when Harsin was there, the boosters did not think he was a good coach. And so, therefore, the sense that you get is they didn't want to turn on the money spigot for him to kind of pay for NIL and upgrade the roster. They just didn't want to provide that for him. Well, now Hugh Freeze is there, and they do, I think, like him, and they do, I think, believe he has a chance to win. I think he's got access to the money, but in some cases, they've chosen not to spend it. And so, therefore, at least that's the sense that I get. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe an Auburn fan could tell me differently. But the sense that I could get is they have access to NIL dollars, and they've chosen not to spend it. I believe that this upcoming offseason, they're going to go on like one of these George Steinbrenner runs of trying to buy a roster paired with some pretty good high school players, including second year for Cam Coleman, assuming they keep him. I think they're going to be trying to be more competitive. And the fact of the matter is Peyton Thorne's not good enough to be good in the SEC. And Auburn was content to allow him to just sort of flounder in the job because they knew they didn't have a good team anyway. That's what I believe is sort of going on there. Aaron Dixon says, culture matters. Imagine Freeze as your leader. Fair enough. Fair enough. I think that's fair enough. I mean, look, Hugh Freeze's personal life is well documented. I think that sometimes, though, I mean, do you have any friends that other people don't like? I mean, sometimes, I feel like in my life I've had friends that other people probably didn't like very much, or at least some people didn't like very much. But they're your friend. You like them no matter what. And part of the reason you like the person that you like is related to how they treat you. This person may have done a bad thing. But if they are good by you, that's sometimes sort of the basis of friendship. And I think that a coach-player relationship can be the same thing too. I mean, Hugh Freeze's personal life, the tawdry aspects of that are well documented. But if he's good to the players, then I'm guessing they're probably okay with him. Now, you may say, well, in this case, he wasn't good to Peyton Thorne. But here's the deal, though. And once again, I'm just sort of riffing on this, just sort of knee-jerk reaction. The players don't want to be lied to. If the quarterback is playing bad, to have the coach acknowledge the quarterback played bad, that probably actually does something to sort of keep the locker room stable. Because if the quarterback played bad and the coach goes to the media is like, no, we think the quarterback played great. Well, now, you know the phrase that probably gets overused now, but I think it has some meaning in this sense, the idea of gaslighting, the idea of telling you a lie as a way of confusing you about what reality even is. If the coach is like, oh, our quarterback played fine, we just got to do whatever else. Well, that would, once again, to use the overused, therapist language, that would be to a degree gaslighting. So as sort of unsavory as it may seem, throwing Thorne under the bus might have actually helped protect the Auburn locker room culture. I think there's at least a chance that's true. And Henry Dion asked a good question. Maybe somebody else asked this too. If playing Vandegrift is prep for playing Milroe. I mean, it can't hurt, right? I mean, as many running quarterbacks as you can face is probably good for a defense for the ones that really matter most. But, of course, in the case of Jalen Milroe, he's obviously a much more accomplished runner than Brock Vandegrift is. But it all probably helps, I'm guessing. Let's see what else. Caleb Meyer says, I think the Tennessee defense is good, but the NC State offense is awful. Grayson McCall is terrible. Maybe so. As we said yesterday, there is still something to a dominant win against a power conference opponent. That is still, I would say, an interesting data point. And as I mentioned, I think it was in our pre-show. We'll see if Alabama, different circumstances, probably, higher level of expectation, can go to Madison. Let's see what kind of win they get against Wisconsin on Saturday. It does just give us some data point here on that. G. Grace all on board the Killing DeBoer train. We'll see if that remains true. We'll see if that's the case for long. Lance D says, I don't care for any coach publicly throwing their quarterback or player under the bus. What you're telling guys when things go wrong and you lose, can't see Kirby doing the same thing as Freeze or Brian Kelly. I think Brian Kelly would probably do it. I think Kelly has done it, but I don't think Kirby Smart would do it. So I think what you're saying, Lance, is probably fair. I would not want Kirby Smart to do that. And I think it ultimately looks good to see coaches own the responsibility. I think what you're saying is plenty fair. I think it's a very reasonable retort to what I said a moment ago. I do. I have a little bit of a suspicion that what actually helps maintain locker room culture sometimes is maybe a little bit of a, I don't want to say it's a nasty business, but it's probably not always as, cut and dry as you might want for it to be. But I think your overall point is plenty fair. I do. I think you're plenty right. It's not a great look. Would not want Kirby to do it. I don't believe Kirby would ever do it. But if we're being honest here, Hugh Freeze is just running a different operation right now than Kirby Smart is, if we're being honest. How about, first of all, middle GA UGA Dog Pound. That's our buddy Brian Whitehead, and he points out that it was his daughter holding up the Brocktober sign that we ran as a part of, I believe we call those melts. I believe it's a melt, a package, sometimes I would call it, a little earlier today, which is good. All right, a couple of final comments, then we're going to go. Yeah, and Lance, I think you bring up a lot of good points. Oh, yeah, Stephen, our buddy Stephen Venanzi going to be in Lexington on Saturday. Stephen, hope to see you there. That's awesome. What a great experience that's going to be. Hopefully the weather is nice enough for us to all be walking around outside the stadium prior to the game. I believe we got a big contingent of DawgNation folks all driving up together, which should be a lot of fun. Oh, Lord, what are they talking about at DawgNation.com right now? Scott Harris. I can't read that, but it's very funny. It's very funny. Senior Dog 54 says, perhaps this year, almost certainly in the near future, 2 SEC teams will play for the national title in their third meeting of the season. He says, I didn't sign up for that, but then again, who cares what an old man thinks? Yeah, we talked about this a lot during the offseason, that it's a strong possibility. That, for a program like Georgia and Texas, for instance, who have almost no real history against each other, like the first college football game I can really remember as a very, very small child was the 83 Cotton Bowl. But, from 83 to 2018, Georgia and Texas didn't play at all. So you could have a lot of history develop really, really fast. And I do think that rematches are about to be just a much bigger part of the college football story. There's a certain professionalization of college football. The NFL has a lot of rematches all the time. And in some cases, it is 3 times in the same season because division foes often face each other in the playoffs too. It's just sort of a fact of life, and we may see a lot more of that in the future. It seems a little less exciting, but, Georgia's rematch against Auburn in the SEC title game in 2017, rematch versus Bama, the 2021 national championship. Those were all still really fun games. Sometimes the rematch gives a little extra context to the game. Scott Harris pointing out that there are 2 Buc-ee's on the way to Lexington if you're driving up, 75. Obviously, there's the Calhoun one, which I was actually at last Friday night after high school football. And there's one Is it Greensboro, Kentucky? Is that what it's called? There's another one right there. So, you got plenty of Buc-ee's opportunities if you're so interested. Let's see what else. All right, final comments. We're going to let you ready to go. Jeff Ingram says his last trip to Lexington was in 1980 for the hammer into the national championship nails. Jeff, that's really cool. Bo Bridges checking in. Bo, we're glad you're here. Anything else? Jamie Huff says sports are about matchups. He says we've got to stop thinking what happens between one team will happen against another team. Yeah, I mean, obviously, each game provides a little bit of an potential for evidence, but which evidence matters, which evidence doesn't, not always easy to determine, especially during the beginning of the season where you have such a limited data set overall. I think you're mostly right about that. Richard D's wondering if this game is going to be an exhibition of the entire running back room. I certainly hope that it is. I do. We said this yesterday. Could be a really good showcase for what we think could be a very talented Georgia running back situation. I think you're right. David Gross says that Stoops looks like Bobo the Clown. Oh, come on. I thought you were about Bozo. Not Bobo, but Bobo's doing fine. I do think that that the vibe around Stoops at Kentucky's got to be really weird. It's got to be really weird. The whole thing's got to be really weird. Let's see what else. Anything else? All right, we got to go for now. All right, good stuff, everybody. Christy says she was trying to be nice to G. Gray. See, Christy, that's what you get for trying to be nice. But always in good fun, of course. All right, y'all check out R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. I want to specifically highlight the plumbing issues here for a moment because if some sort of water thing happens to your house, your water heater stops working, or like, heaven forbid, a pipe burst or something like that, an emergency situation like that is the kind of thing that you want to act fast on. Our friends at R.S. Andrews give you a chance to do that. So please find them online at rsandrews.com. They can strike fast, kind of get you back in the game if you've got some sort of plumbing emergency. I want you to we talk about ACs all the time, but I want you to think about R.S. Andrews when it comes to your plumbing issues. So please find them online at rsandrews.com. Have a great day. We're back tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then, everybody.